35 years is long enough to watch entire generations disappear. Long enough to see presidents come and go. Technologies transform the world, and children grow into grandparents. Yet for one man inside California's infamous Folsom State Prison, time moved differently. The prison gates never opened for him. The routines never truly changed. Day after day, year after year, he remained trapped within the same institution while the outside world accelerated beyond recognition. By the time his story attracted wider attention, decades had already vanished. The question was no longer how he entered prison. The mystery was how anyone survives losing that much of a life. Most prison sentences are measured in years. Some stretch into decades. But spending 35 consecutive years inside a single prison creates something far more profound than punishment. It creates a separate reality. The world beyond the walls becomes distant, almost abstract. Streets are rebuilt. Neighborhoods disappear. Entire cultural eras rise and fall. Yet inside prison, the calendar advances while daily existence often feels frozen. For prisoners who remain incarcerated that long, the greatest challenge is not merely serving time. It is enduring the relentless accumulation of time itself without losing the ability to imagine a future. Folsom State Prison has spent nearly a century and a half building a reputation few institutions can match. Opened in 1880, it became one of America's earliest maximum security prisons and developed a lasting image associated with violence, discipline, and endurance. Prisoners lived behind thick stone walls and iron doors that symbolized the harsh era of incarceration. Over the decades, Folsom became known not only for the crimes that brought men there, but for what happened after the cell doors closed. Some left. Some died. And a small number remained so long that prison became the only world they truly knew. For a prisoner serving 35 years inside such a place, survival becomes a story of adaptation. The prison population changes. Cellmates come and go. Staff retire. Administrations shift. Entire prison cultures evolve. Yet the long-term prisoner remains, witnessing everything while becoming part of the institution itself. New arrivals hear stories about men who have spent decades inside. Those men become living reminders of what prison can do to a human life. They are no longer simply inmates. They become fixtures of the environment, almost as permanent as the walls surrounding them. What makes this story especially unsettling is that lengthy imprisonment creates a paradox. Society often imagines release as the ultimate goal. Yet after enough years, freedom itself can become frightening. The outside world changes faster than memory can keep pace. Relationships fade. Opportunities vanish. Familiar places no longer exist. For prisoners who have spent decades behind bars, the prospect of returning to society may carry as much uncertainty as hope. The prison that once represented confinement can slowly become the only environment they understand. Somewhere within the history of Folsom lies the story of a man who spent 35 years watching life pass from behind prison walls. His experience raises difficult questions about punishment, endurance, and the human capacity to adapt to extreme confinement. How does someone survive that long inside one of California's most notorious prisons? What happens to the mind when decades disappear behind bars? And when so much time has been lost, what remains waiting on the other side of the gate? Folsom State Prison stands along the American River in the city of Folsom, roughly 25 miles northeast of Sacramento. Its location appears almost peaceful from a distance, surrounded by landscapes more commonly associated with California's natural beauty than one of the nation's most recognized correctional institutions. Yet behind its perimeter lies a prison whose name became synonymous with incarceration itself. For generations of Americans, Folsom was more than a place. It became a symbol. The prison's reputation spread far beyond California, entering popular culture and criminal justice history as one of the most famous prisons ever built. When Folsom State Prison opened in 1880, it became California's second state prison and one of the oldest operating correctional facilities in the United States. Much of the original construction was carried out by inmate labor. Prisoners quarried granite from nearby sites and helped build the very walls that would later confine thousands of men. The resulting structure reflected 19th century ideas about punishment, massive stone architecture, heavy iron barriers, and an emphasis on security through physical control. Long before modern prison design emerged, Folsom had already established itself as a formidable institution intended to contain some of the state's most serious offenders. The prison developed a reputation for toughness early in its history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, correctional systems across America often relied on strict discipline and hard labor. Folsom was no exception. Its remote location, imposing design, and rigid routines reinforced the image of a place where punishment was meant to be felt. Over time, stories of violence, escape attempts, disciplinary practices, and inmate struggles contributed to a public perception that Folsom was among the harshest prisons in California. Whether entirely deserved or not, the reputation endured for decades and became part of the institution's identity. Security has always played a central role in Folsom's operation. The prison has housed inmates serving lengthy sentences, including individuals convicted of serious violent offenses. Its security measures evolved over the years as correctional philosophy and technology changed, but the institution remained focused on managing high-risk populations. Generations of correctional officers worked within an environment where maintaining order was a constant challenge. The combination of long-term incarceration, gang activity, and overcrowding during certain periods created pressures that repeatedly tested prison administrators and inmates alike. Folsom's name became internationally recognizable in 1968 when Johnny Cash performed a live concert inside the prison. The resulting album, At Folsom Prison, introduced millions of listeners to the institution's name and mythology. While the performance brought unprecedented attention to prison life, it also highlighted the reality that behind the headlines and music stood thousands of incarcerated men serving sentences measured in years and sometimes decades. For some prisoners, the passage of time inside Folsom would far exceed the public's imagination of what incarceration truly meant. By the time the prisoner at the center of this story entered Folsom, the institution already carried nearly a century of history. Every corridor reflected accumulated decades of confinement. Every housing unit contained reminders of the generations who had passed through before. Unlike newer correctional facilities designed with modern principles in mind, Folsom possessed a sense of permanence that could feel overwhelming. For a man facing years behind those walls, the prison represented a challenge. For a man who would ultimately spend 35 years there, it became the setting for an extraordinary test of endurance that few people could fully comprehend. At the center of this story is not a notorious escape, a prison riot, or a famous criminal case. It is the extraordinary reality of a man who spent approximately 35 years incarcerated inside Folsom State Prison. Unlike stories defined by a single dramatic event, this one is defined by duration. Year after year, while inmates arrived and departed, he remained. The prison became the constant backdrop of his adult life. What makes the story remarkable is not simply the length of confinement, but what that length reveals about the experience of long-term imprisonment inside one of America's most historic correctional institutions. Documented accounts from Folsom have occasionally highlighted prisoners who spent decades inside its walls. One such inmate, Greg Hamilton, described having spent more than 3 decades at Folsom by 2017, making him one of the institution's long-term fixtures. He spoke openly about surviving the prison culture of the 1980s and watching enormous changes unfold around him while remaining incarcerated. "I'm kind of becoming one of the mainstays of the prison," he reflected after more than 30 years behind the walls. His words captured something difficult for most people to comprehend: the gradual transformation from prisoner to permanent resident of the institution itself. The longer a person remains imprisoned, the more unusual their relationship with time becomes. A 5-year sentence has a visible end. A 10-year sentence can still be measured against familiar milestones. But after 3 decades, time stops feeling temporary. Prisoners serving extremely long terms often witness multiple generations of inmates cycle through the system. Younger prisoners enter and leave while older prisoners remain. Correctional officers retire. Administrators change. Policies evolve. Entire prison cultures shift. Yet the long-term prisoner continues waking up in the same environment, experiencing change without participating in the broader society where those changes originate. For prisoners who entered Folsom in the 1980s, the contrast between prison and the outside world became increasingly dramatic. During those decades, personal computers entered homes, the internet emerged, mobile phones became commonplace, and society transformed in ways that would have been difficult to imagine at the beginning of their sentences. Inside prison, however, daily life remained governed by schedules, counts, security procedures, and institutional rules. While the outside world accelerated, prison life often moved according to rhythms that changed slowly. The gap between those realities widened with every passing year. Another reason this story matters is that it challenges assumptions about what a prison sentence actually means. Public discussions often focus on conviction and punishment, yet much less attention is given to the experience of serving decades behind bars. Long-term incarceration creates consequences that extend far beyond confinement. Family relationships weaken. Parents die. Children grow up. Friendships disappear. The prisoner becomes increasingly disconnected from the life that existed before incarceration. By the time decades have passed, many of the social anchors that once defined identity have either changed dramatically or vanished altogether. This is the central conflict of the story. A man entered Folsom as an inmate. Over 35 years, he witnessed a prison evolve around him while enduring one of the longest stretches of continuous confinement imaginable within a single institution. The question is no longer simply how he survived those years. The deeper question is what those years did to him. To understand that, it is necessary to move beyond the sentence itself and step inside the world where those decades unfolded. Inside the cells, routines, restrictions, and realities that shaped everyday life at Folsom State Prison. Life inside Folsom State Prison was shaped by architecture that originated in another century. Much of the original facility was constructed from granite and designed according to 19th century correctional principles. The prison's older cell blocks were built for control rather than comfort. Narrow cells, steel bars, concrete surfaces, and limited personal space define the environment. For prisoners serving long sentences, these physical surroundings became more than temporary accommodations. They became the backdrop of daily existence. A man who spent 35 years at Folsom would have looked at the same walls thousands of times, watching seasons pass through small windows while remaining confined inside. Space was one of the prison system's recurring challenges. Like many California institutions, Folsom experienced periods of overcrowding, particularly during the late 20th century when the state's inmate population expanded dramatically. Housing pressures affected daily life in numerous ways, from cell assignments to access to programs and services. For prisoners already facing decades behind bars, overcrowding added another layer of stress to an environment where privacy was scarce. Living in close quarters with other inmates required constant awareness. Small disputes could escalate quickly, and long-term prisoners often learned that avoiding unnecessary conflict was essential to survival. Security procedures governed nearly every movement. Counts, inspections, controlled movement schedules, and strict regulations structure the day. Prisoners could not simply walk where they wished or decide how to spend their time. Doors opened and closed according to institutional schedules. Officers monitored housing units, yards, and work assignments. Every aspect of daily life existed within a system designed to maintain order among a large incarcerated population. For someone spending decades inside the prison, these routines became deeply ingrained. Over time, institutional rules often shaped behavior as thoroughly as the walls shaped the physical environment. Food represented another constant feature of prison life. Meals followed schedules established by the institution rather than personal preference. Prisoners ate what was provided, often in large dining facilities designed to serve substantial populations efficiently. While food was rarely the defining feature of incarceration, it became one of the repetitive markers of passing time. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner divided the day into predictable segments. For prisoners serving extraordinarily long sentences, countless meals blended together into a routine that repeated year after year, creating a rhythm that rarely changed regardless of what happened beyond the prison perimeter. Isolation existed in different forms. Not every prisoner spent years in solitary confinement, but incarceration itself imposed separation from the outside world. Family visits were limited by distance, schedules, and personal circumstances. Communication remained controlled through institutional procedures. Even prisoners housed in general population experienced the reality of being cut off from normal social life. The longer a sentence lasted, the greater the risk that outside relationships would weaken. For a prisoner spending 35 years at Folsom, maintaining meaningful connections beyond the walls could become increasingly difficult as decades accumulated. Yet despite the restrictions, prison conditions were not static. Folsom evolved over the years as correctional policies changed. Court decisions influenced prison operations, and administrators adapted to new challenges. Medical services, educational opportunities, and rehabilitation programs varied across different periods. Technology slowly altered certain aspects of prison management. But for long-term prisoners, change often arrived gradually. Decades behind bars meant witnessing shifts that short-term inmates never experienced. Through every policy adjustment and institutional reform, one reality remained constant. Each morning began behind locked doors, and each night ended there, as another day disappeared into a sentence measured not in years, but in generations. For a prisoner serving decades at Folsom, daily life was built around repetition. The day began when the prison woke, not when the inmate chose to wake. Counts, meals, work assignments, and movement schedules divided the hours into predictable segments. Over time, these routines became so familiar that many prisoners could anticipate the rhythm of the institution without looking at a clock. The challenge was not simply enduring one difficult day. It was enduring thousands of similar days in succession. For someone who remained at Folsom for 35 years, routine became both a survival mechanism and a reminder of how much time had passed. Human interaction inside the prison was unavoidable, but carefully navigated. Prisoners lived among men from different backgrounds, cultures, and criminal histories, all sharing the same confined environment. Long-term inmates often learned that survival depended on understanding the unwritten rules of prison life. Respect, caution, and awareness could be as important as physical strength. New prisoners entered the institution regularly, while others were transferred or released. The long-term prisoner watched this constant turnover while remaining in place, creating the unusual experience of becoming older and more established within a population that was always changing around him. Work and structured activities provided some prisoners with a sense of purpose. Folsom has offered various institutional jobs, educational programs, and vocational opportunities over the years, though access depended on classification, behavior, and available resources. For inmates serving extremely long sentences, these activities could help break the monotony of confinement. A job assignment, a class, or participation in a program offered a way to measure progress within an environment where traditional life milestones were largely absent. Even small responsibilities could become significant when decades stretched ahead with no clear sense of when prison life might end. Maintaining relationships with the outside world was often one of the hardest aspects of long-term incarceration. Family members aged, moved away, or passed on. Children grew into adults. Friends built lives that continued without the prisoner. Visits, letters, and phone calls became vital connections to a world that increasingly felt distant. For someone who spent 35 years at Folsom, the passage of time was visible not only through prison routines but through the gradual transformation of the people waiting beyond the walls. Every missed holiday, birthday, and family event became part of the cost of a sentence measured in decades. Long-term prisoners also developed personal routines that helped them endure confinement. Some read extensively. Others exercised, studied, wrote, or pursued religious activities. Creating structure within the larger institutional structure could provide a sense of control. Without such coping strategies, the endless repetition of prison life could become overwhelming. Men who survived decades behind bars often spoke about the importance of finding meaning in small achievements and daily habits. When the future feels uncertain and distant, even modest goals can become essential tools for preserving motivation and identity. As the years accumulated, the prisoner's experience changed in ways that shorter-term inmates rarely encountered. He became familiar with the prison's rhythms, its staff, its changing populations, and its evolving culture. Younger inmates arrived with knowledge of a world that had transformed while he remained incarcerated. Conversations increasingly highlighted the gap between prison life and modern society. The long-term prisoner occupied a strange position, deeply experienced within the institution, yet increasingly removed from the world outside it. Each day followed a familiar pattern, but each passing year made the eventual prospect of freedom feel both more important and more uncertain. The human mind is not naturally designed to process confinement on the scale of decades. Most people organize life around change. New places, new relationships, new experiences, and future plans. Long-term imprisonment interrupts that pattern. Inside Folsom, a prisoner serving 35 years faced a reality in which the same walls, routines, and restrictions repeated endlessly. The challenge was not merely physical confinement. It was maintaining a sense of identity while living in an environment where individual control over daily life remained severely limited. Over time, the psychological burden of such confinement could become as significant as the sentence itself. Researchers and correctional experts have long documented the effects of prolonged incarceration. While experiences vary from person to person, many long-term prisoners describe a gradual narrowing of their world. Decisions become limited. Institutional schedules replace personal choice. The prison environment dictates when to eat, move, work, and sleep. As years pass, these conditions can produce what is often referred to as institutionalization, the process through which prison routines become deeply embedded in a person's behavior and expectations. For someone who spent 35 years inside a single institution, that process could shape nearly every aspect of daily life and perception. One of the most powerful psychological challenges was the passage of time itself. In ordinary life, years are marked by milestones, careers, marriages, travel, achievements, and personal growth. In prison, those markers are often absent or dramatically altered. Long-term inmates frequently describe time as both fast and slow. Individual days can feel endless, yet decades somehow disappear. The calendar advances relentlessly, creating the unsettling realization that large portions of life have passed without the experiences most people associate with adulthood. For a prisoner at Folsom, each passing year carried the weight of opportunities that could never be recovered. Relationships played a critical role in psychological survival. Maintaining contact with family, friends, religious communities, or support networks often helped prisoners preserve a connection to life beyond the prison walls. Yet sustaining those connections across decades was extraordinarily difficult. Deaths, distance, financial hardship, and changing circumstances frequently weakened outside ties. Many long-term prisoners experience profound loss while incarcerated, unable to participate fully in family events or mourn loved ones in the ways people normally do. The emotional consequences accumulated over time, adding another layer to the burden of long-term confinement. To cope, many prisoners developed strategies that allowed them to endure psychologically. Some turned to education, reading extensively and pursuing self-improvement. Others focused on religion, exercise, mentorship, or structure routines. These activities provided more than distraction. They offered meaning. In an environment where freedom was restricted, purpose became a valuable resource. Men who survived decades in prison often spoke about the importance of maintaining discipline over their thoughts and emotions. Without such anchors, the monotony and uncertainty of long-term incarceration could become overwhelming. Perhaps the most complex psychological effect emerged near the possibility of release itself. The outside world changed dramatically during 35 years. Technology transformed communication. Communities evolved. Social norms shifted. For a prisoner who had spent most of his adult life inside Folsom, freedom could represent both hope and anxiety. The institution that once symbolized confinement had also become familiar. Prison routines were predictable. Society beyond the walls was not. After decades of adaptation to prison life, the prospect of returning to a vastly different world presented a new challenge, one that many long-term prisoners feared almost as much as the years they had already endured. A prisoner who spends 35 years inside a single institution does not simply serve a sentence. He becomes a witness to history. During those decades, Folsom State Prison experienced changes, crises, and reforms that shaped daily life for everyone inside its walls. Some events unfolded suddenly, disrupting routines that normally operated with rigid predictability. Others developed gradually through policy changes and court decisions. For long-term prisoners, these moments became markers of time. While the outside world measured history through elections and world events, inmates often measured it through the major incidents that altered life inside the prison itself. One of the recurring realities of California prisons during the late 20th century was overcrowding. As inmate populations increased across the state, correctional institutions faced mounting pressure. Folsom was not immune. Housing units became more crowded, resources were stretched, and administrators faced growing challenges in maintaining order. Overcrowding eventually became the subject of extensive legal and public scrutiny throughout California's prison system. For prisoners serving long terms, these developments were not abstract policy debates. They affected living conditions, access to programs, medical care, and daily routines inside the institution. Violence remained another persistent concern throughout various periods of Folsom's history. Like many maximum security prisons, the institution experienced incidents involving inmate conflict, gang activity, and security responses. Lockdowns periodically disrupted normal operations, restricting movement and limiting access to work assignments, recreation, and programs. During lockdowns, prisoners could spend extended periods confined to their housing units while staff investigated incidents or restored order. For someone incarcerated over 3.5 decades, such disruptions became part of the broader experience of prison life, reminders that stability inside a correctional institution could change without warning. Changes in correctional philosophy also influenced life at Folsom. Across the decades, prison administrators and state officials increasingly emphasized rehabilitation, education, and reentry preparation alongside traditional security concerns. Programs expanded and evolved, though availability often varied depending on resources and institutional priorities. Long-term inmates witnessed these shifts firsthand. Men who entered prison during one era often found themselves living under very different policies years later. The prison remained the same institution, but its approach to incarceration gradually changed as broader debates about criminal justice unfolded across California and the United States. For prisoners serving exceptionally long sentences, parole hearings and legal reviews often became major personal turning points. Years of preparation could culminate in a single hearing. Some inmates received opportunities for release, while others were denied and returned to their cells to wait for another review years later. The emotional significance of these moments was immense. A favorable decision could mean the possibility of freedom. An unfavorable one could extend incarceration indefinitely. For many long-term prisoners, life became divided into periods measured by parole eligibility dates rather than by ordinary calendar years. Through all these developments, overcrowding, lockdowns, policy changes, legal challenges, and shifting prison cultures, the long-term prisoner remained at Folsom. New inmates arrived unaware of events that older prisoners remembered vividly. Veteran correctional officers retired and were replaced by new generations of staff. Entire eras of prison history passed through the institution while he continued serving his sentence. The most remarkable fact was not any single incident. It was that he endured them all, accumulating decades of experience inside one prison and moving steadily toward the moment when the question of what came next could no longer be postponed. After 35 years inside Folsom State Prison, the most significant outcome was not a single event but the sheer scale of time that had been consumed by incarceration. 3.5 decades represented more than a prison term. They represented an entire era of life lived behind institutional walls. During those years, California changed, the country changed, and the world changed. Yet for the prisoner at the center of this story, every transformation occurred at a distance. The calendar continued moving forward, but much of life unfolded elsewhere. The ultimate result of long-term imprisonment was measured not only in years served, but in years that could never be reclaimed. For prisoners who spend decades incarcerated, release does not erase the effects of confinement. Correctional researchers have repeatedly noted that lengthy imprisonment creates challenges extending far beyond the prison gate. Individuals released after very long sentences often encounter a society that differs dramatically from the one they left behind. Technology, employment practices, communication, transportation, and social expectations may all have changed. What appears ordinary to most people can feel unfamiliar to someone who has spent decades inside a controlled environment. The consequences of long-term incarceration continue long after a sentence is technically ended. In the case of prisoners who remain incarcerated for multiple decades, another outcome emerges. They become part of the institution's history. Few inmates witness as many changes as those who spend 30 years or more in a single prison. They observe shifts in prison culture, corrections policy, staffing, and inmate populations that shorter-term prisoners never experience. Their memories often span entire eras of institutional life. In that sense, the long-term prisoner becomes both participant and witness, carrying a perspective shaped by years that few others can fully understand. Accounts from long-serving inmates at Folsom illustrate this reality. Men who spent decades there described watching generations of prisoners pass through the institution while they remained. Some became known amongst staff and inmates simply because they had been present for so long. Their stories reflected endurance more than notoriety. The outcome was not fame or public recognition. It was survival. Day after day, year after year, they continued navigating prison life despite the emotional, psychological, and social costs that accumulated over time. The broader impact of such cases extends beyond any individual prisoner. Stories of decades-long incarceration have become part of ongoing discussions about sentencing, rehabilitation, parole, and the purpose of imprisonment itself. Supporters of lengthy sentences often view them as necessary consequences for serious crimes. Critics question what is achieved when incarceration stretches across entire lifetimes. Long-term prisoners occupy the center of that debate, because their experiences reveal the human realities hidden behind statistics and legal decisions. Whether release eventually came or confinement continued, one fact remained unchanged. 35 years had been spent inside Folsom State Prison. No parole decision, policy change, or future opportunity could restore those decades. The prison had taken possession of a vast portion of a human life, and the effects of that loss would remain long after the sentence itself ceased to be the defining fact of the story. What remained was the larger question that every long-term imprisonment leaves behind. What does it truly mean to lose 35 years behind bars? 35 years inside Folsom State Prison is a figure that sounds almost abstract until it is measured against a human life. It is longer than many careers, longer than most marriages, long enough for children to become parents and for parents to become memories. Numbers alone cannot capture what those years represented. Behind every day was a locked door, a controlled schedule, and a world viewed from a distance. The story is not remarkable because time passed. Time passes for everyone. It is remarkable because so much of that time was spent in a place designed to separate a person from ordinary life. Folsom itself remains one of the most recognizable prisons in American history, but institutions are ultimately remembered through the people who live inside them. Buildings, walls, and security measures tell only part of the story. The rest is found in the experiences of the men who spent years and sometimes decades behind those walls. Long-term prisoners reveal dimensions of incarceration that are often overlooked. Their stories expose the reality that prison is not simply a sentence imposed by a court. It is a lived experience that unfolds day after day, often across enormous stretches of time. The psychological impact of such confinement cannot be reduced to a single conclusion. Some prisoners adapt. Some struggle. Many do both at different points in their sentences. Survival often depends on finding purpose where purpose seems scarce, maintaining hope when hope becomes difficult, and preserving identity within a system built around uniformity and control. For those who spend decades incarcerated, resilience is not demonstrated through one dramatic act. It is demonstrated through thousands of ordinary days endured without surrendering completely to despair. This story also forces a broader reflection on the meaning of punishment. Society debates sentences in terms of years, but years are lived one day at a time. 35 years represents more than a legal outcome. It represents birthdays missed, relationships altered, opportunities lost, and entire chapters of life that unfolded behind prison walls. Whatever one's views on crime and punishment, the reality of such prolonged incarceration remains profound. It is impossible to consider the scale of that commitment without confronting the immense human consequences attached to it. Perhaps that is why stories like this continue to resonate. They are not merely prison stories. They are stories about time itself. Time is the one resource every person possesses in equal measure, and it is the one resource that can never be recovered once spent. A prisoner serving 35 years at Folsom experiences that truth in its most extreme form. The sentence is not only measured in confinement. It is measured in the irreversible passage of life from one year to the next. When the prison gate finally opens, or when it never does, the central fact remains unchanged. 35 years have passed. The world outside has moved forward, carrying on without pause. The prisoner has endured an experience that few people will ever fully understand. And perhaps the most haunting question left behind is not what happened during those years, but what any of us would become if we watched 3.5 decades of life disappear from behind the same walls.